Well, welcome to Building Community Ferment. We have had a few of these workshops in the past, but today is the April workshop on brining whole veggies. So some of our past topics, if you are new to this series today, have been making sourdough, making different kinds of sauerkraut, so shredded vegetable ferments, making a kind of spicy kraut that is I call kraut chi, which I've borrowed from Sandra Katz's recipe. We had a kombucha workshop. So there's been several different topics, and I like to just start with the reasoning behind this workshop and where I'm coming from. If you're new to this group, is that I love working with the Yolo County Public Library Davis branch because this workshop has always been free and accessible. And it's meant to be a space for us to practice experimenting together. So it's not a place to become experts. It's a place to be creative and try new things and learn a little bit more about fermentation and really like pique your interest in fermentation as something that you might want to learn more about on your own, or even kind of dive into your own histories or your own family stories about ferments, because they're there whether you grew up eating them or not. You know, a lot of human culture has celebrated fermented foods as a part of their staple diet. And often these are some of our most culturally meaningful foods. So I hope this workshop is a place for you to just kind of learn more, get curious, and I hope to give you just some basic introductory information, which is enough to carry you through your own kind of journey into the world of fermentation. So thank you all for joining again today. I'm just gonna remind folks that you should feel free to use the chat if you have questions or anything comes up during this lecture, this cooking show. Normally, I always tell people normally in person, I would have, big tables spread out and we'd all be doing this together, and it would be much more of a community in the Building Community Ferment. So our online format is a little less conducive to that. But like I said, everyone will get a kit if you live in the local area. I'll drop off a kit to you this weekend that has everything you'll need to kind of replicate what I've done here. So welcome to folks who have joined since I began. This is Building Community Ferment, and we are going to be working on brining whole vegetables today in the workshop series. So I'm going to put my email in the chat, and I encourage you to use the chat as well for any questions that you have. It's communityferment@gmail.com. And you can use this email to send me any questions after the workshop. And most importantly, send me an email if you would like to receive a kit. They're free, and I will gladly deliver if you're in our kind of local radius here in Davis, or like Woodland or Winters or West Sacramento. And but I'll need your address. So that's why if you could please send me an email with your address, I'll be happy to do that. All right, cool. So welcome, fermenters. So today I am going to demonstrate a couple of the whole vegetable brines. And I'm going to talk a little bit about brining as a process versus some of the other things I've done in this workshop. And then I'll show you some that I made last week so that you can get a sense of what a finished product looks like. And I'll talk a little bit about the information that I'm using when I'm coming up with these recipes or when I'm using these recipes. So in the past, if you've been in some of these workshops before, we have done a lot of vegetables that are shredded. They're shredded or they're chopped really finely. And we do that, especially working with something like cabbage, which has so much water in it, so that when we shred it and we add salt to it, and then we use our hands to apply that force to break down the cell walls, the cabbage releases so much water and liquid. And I've kind of shown in the past where you pick up a handful of it and it's just dripping with water. So in those instances, when we're making those shredded vegetable ferments, we don't need to make a brine, because basically the vegetable is making its own brine. It's making its own liquid by the water that's held within the vegetable itself. And we use salt and pressure to release that water from the vegetable. But today we're going to be working with whole vegetables. So that might mean literally, a whole pickling cucumber, as they're called, or that might mean big chunks of vegetables, cauliflower. And this is, these are like big carrot squares. So we're going to be working with whole vegetables, not in the sense that it's like a whole head of cauliflower, but rather we're working with vegetables that aren't being shredded and broken down so that they produce their own liquid. So that's the caveat for today. And in some of the shredded vegetable ferments that I've done in other workshops, we've added some seasonings. So sometimes we'll add things like garlic or ginger or chilies. And sometimes I put in dried spices, but I've been very careful because when you're using a shredded vegetable ferment and you add spices, the flavor really intensifies. So I've ruined many batches of kraut by adding like a whole handful of caraway seed or something. And it's just too much. And it really takes over the ferment. So the difference with brining is that we create this massive volume of liquid and it can handle a lot more spices. So that's an exciting part about working with brining vegetables, is that we get to use a lot more spices than we would if we were doing a shredded ferment. So those are some things to look forward to in my demonstration. There's a great question in the chat that says, how is fermentation different than pickling? So that's a great question, and something that I can say a little bit more about as I begin in this process. So the whole workshop series of Building Community Ferment has been working with food fermentation that happens from the microorganisms themselves that are present already on the plants, vegetables, garlic, ginger that we are using to make the food. So we're not ever adding something like vinegar, which would quickly give us that nice tangy sour taste. We're actually manipulating the environment of these veggies by adding salt and water only. So it's with those two ingredients, salt, water, and then the vegetables themselves, we're creating a kind of condition, a very, salinic or with lots of salt environment, so that certain microorganisms, they don't like that kind of environment, and other microorganisms, they love it. And we're trying to cultivate an environment where certain microorganisms, very broadly referred to as like lactic acid bacteria, we're trying to cultivate those bacteria so that we get those nice, tangy, soury flavors of a fermented vegetable, but we're not using vinegar. We're actually using the microorganisms that are present on the vegetables themselves. So oftentimes in Western US society, when we talk about pickles, we typically mean vinegar cucumbers, right? So if someone's like, do you want a pickle? In this, culture and environment, that typically means, do you want a pickle that has been soured in vinegar? And those are delicious. I love those. But that's not what we're doing today. So you could call these pickles, and actually, I know in India and in other places in Southeast Asia, they will use the language of a pickle. And sometimes that means it has vinegar, but sometimes that also means it is naturally fermented or fermented with the microorganisms that are already on the vegetables themselves. And then it cultivates the lactic acid bacteria. And that's what we're going to do. So if you like to call them pickles, you should go ahead and call them pickles. If you want to call them wild fermented veggies, you call them wild fermented veggies. The language is really up to you to decide. Although I would say that the common language, typically pickle means made with vinegar. But you can always explain that to your friends later if you want. So we're going to be making lactic acid bacteria pickles with a couple different ingredients. And we're going to do that by creating a brine. So just to quickly recap for some folks who've joined, instead of the other veggie workshops that I've offered, where we start by grating or shredding veggies to then create liquid, we're actually going to create a separate liquid that is called a brine. So brine is basically salt water. That's all it really is. but it has a particular solution. So it has a particular amount of salt per water. So that means that, sorry, I'm just going to mute folks who came. Hope you don't mind, not trying to be rude. Cool. So we're going to create a brine that is basically a salt water. And we're going to use that as a way to provide a liquid to veggies that aren't going to make a lot of liquid, either because they're whole or because they are very big and we're not breaking them down with salt. So any questions about that? That was a really great question. But before I kind of get started, are there any other general questions about fermentation or versus pickling or brine versus some of the other things we've done, or any broad questions? If they come up, feel free to shoot them into the chat. I have that open and I can answer those questions as they come in. I've often talked about Sandor Katz, who is an author that I really enjoy, who writes about fermentation. And he has this great book called The Art of Fermentation. It's kind of like an encyclopedia of lots of different ferments, lots of different stories about ferments, recipes from all over the world. And this one is great for lots of things, but it's actually, it doesn't have a really easy to follow brining recipe. So I'm not going to use him for this workshop, even though I love a lot of the work that he does. I found it in this other book that I have called Fermented Vegetables, Creative Recipes for Fermenting 64 Vegetables and Herbs. And it's by Kirsten Shockey and Christopher Shockey. And I know that Kirsten Shockey has quite a social media following too. So if you're someone who wants to know more about this world and you're on Instagram or Twitter, Kirsten Shockey has a lot to say about it and has some neat workshops actually that she offers if you wanted to know more, go a little deeper into certain ferments. So this recipe book is really fun. It's got a lot of recipes. So that's something that if you're someone who really likes recipes and you like following steps to get you to a certain outcome, I would highly recommend this Fermented Vegetables book by her, because it has so many recipes based on whatever ingredient you want to use. So this book, though, has a really nice introductory content that I'll make copies of for everybody in your kit. So make sure you email me your address, email me communityferment@gmail.com. There's this great thing, I'll read it to you. I don't know if you can see it, but they have this thing about just basic brine. So they're like, here it is, basic brine, 1 gallon of water to half a cup of salt. And they use that as the basic brine for a lot of things that are fermented with kind of hard root vegetables. Like I'm going to make a cauliflower one, carrots, very dense veggies. They recommend that 1 gallon of water to half a cup of salt. For other vegetables that are very porous or very soft in the middle, like a cucumber, which is actually very difficult. I've tried maybe 6 or 7 times, and I've been successful maybe twice making a cucumber pickle, a fermented cucumber. Every time they come out super soft and gnarly, and I don't want to eat them. So I'm going to follow her recipe for a cucumber brine, which is 1 gallon of water to 3/4 cup of salt. So it's a little higher salinity, more salt in the brine for things like cucumbers, or I'm going to do one with asparagus, which is also a very porous, soft vegetable, right? As compared to something dense and hard like a root vegetable or a cauliflower or a radish for that matter. So that's the basic recipe for the brine. It's basically 1 gallon of water to half a cup of salt. You can use this method, this brining method, to ferment like anything, really. I mean, whatever you feel like in the realm of vegetables, really, I encourage you to experiment. You can leave things whole, you can chop them in half, but there are a couple of things to consider before I start to demo that you want to keep in mind before you start into the world of brining. The first is that you want the materials you're using to be similar in their constitution. So for example, if you're going to ferment something very hard like a beet, you don't want to put that along with something very soft like a zucchini, because they're going to ferment at different rates due to their density. And you might end up with zucchini that just turns to mush by the time the hard beet is, tasty and ready to be eaten. So you want to choose items that have a similar kind of constitution, a similar density, if that helps you think about it. Just like you would do if you were cooking, if you were making a stir fry or something, you put the zucchini in last because it only takes a second to cook, right? Versus carrots or something that's a little harder that would take longer. So we'll keep that same principle in mind when we're brining, is making sure that things have a similar constitution to them when they're together. So that one is very important in terms of preparing, what it is you want to brine. There was one other kind of thing to keep in mind is this is saying, what did she say? Submerge under the brine and all is fine. So that's another thing you want to keep your eye on in the process, is just to make sure that you've made enough brine, that everything is underwater. And really, as long as things stay underwater, they are going to be fine. There's a good question that says, some people use a warm temperature brine and others use a boiling brine. Oh, in your experience, is there any difference or certain advantage over a certain way? That's a good question. I was reading a little bit about people who use boiling water as a way to kind of parboil the vegetables. Like I was reading in the Sandra Katz book that's, I guess there's some conflict about eating raw beans, like green beans. I don't really know that, and I've never done that. I just use a room temperature water and dilute with salt, and I haven't had any problem with that. But I know that certainly when some people use vinegar brines, they boil it because they also are usually adding sugar, and sugar dissolves better in warm liquids than in room temperature ones. So that might be part of the issue, is to help the salt or the sugar fully integrate. You use a warmer liquid. I don't know that it has to be boiling, but for my sake, I'm just using room temperature. Yeah. All right, cool. I'm going to demonstrate for you today 2 recipes from Kirsten Shockey's book. The first one is, I'm going to show you the one that I made, which is a dilly bean, or a fermented green bean, and something that she calls edgy veggies, which is like a spicy a spicy cauliflower, carrot, jalapeno, onion mix that I hadn't made before. And it's so good. We've almost eaten all of it, and I just made it a few days ago. So I'm going to go ahead and show you those right now. This one I fermented, I started both of them on April 5th, which was about 2 Mondays ago. And after about 5 days, this is that edgy veggie mix that she says. You can see the water is a little cloudy, which is fine. That's good. It's a sign that it's working. And it has chopped cauliflower, carrot, jalapeno, and onion in it. And then this one is the dilly bean. So it's just the whole green bean with garlic and mustard seeds, and then the brine. And I'm going to pop it, and let's see if you can hear it. All right, ready? Oh, not really. But look at the bubbles start to come up on the top. It's alive. Sounds like a soda, to me. So it's very active because I haven't put this one in the fridge yet, because I was tasting it every couple of days and it was still like really salty. Ooh, now it's really good. Oh man, I'm impressed. Honestly, I don't usually make them this good. This is pretty darn good. So it's still really crunchy, like you can hear the crunch, but it doesn't taste raw. It's soft in the middle, but the outside is crunchy. And that to me is like ideal. That's what you're going for with something that is fermented this way. It's not going to taste like raw vegetable. It's going to be softened through the process because it's bacteria that are basically eating it and kind of causing some decay to happen, which is making it softer. But you don't want it to get mushy. So there's this great moment where it's between the raw, hard vegetable and something a little digested for you by microorganisms that tastes wonderful. So these are fabulous. And I think at this point, I really like the way they taste, but it has been since April 5th. So a week and a half, these have been out in my kitchen versus just 5 days actually, where I thought this one tasted really good. And then I put it in my refrigerator. So as always, as I've said a lot in my other workshops, you have to trust your senses. When you know something's done, it's because it smells good to you, because it tastes good to you, because it looks good to you. I'll give you a rough number and I'll give you some things to look out for in terms of how many days, but it always comes down to your senses and your sensibilities. Whatever you like is when it's done and when it's ready. Good question is, and is this bacteria good for gut health? Is that a benefit or just taste? So yeah, if you're someone who's kind of been following some pop culture discussions about bacteria in your gut or probiotics or your microbiome, these wild fermented foods, some research points to the way that they have been a part of a beneficial kind of diet or dietary regimen, right? I'm trying to be careful a little bit because I think there's a little hype around this as well. And certainly if you've gone to the grocery store and looked at some products, you'd think, it was like the elixir of life, kombucha, it would make you live forever, the way they talk about how good it is for you. So sometimes those health claims are overblown, but I will say that there have been scientific studies that, and there are more happening now, that are trying to show how eating a diet rich in fermented foods like these that we're making today, meaning they're fermented using bacteria and yeast and fungi that are already on the vegetables that we're working with, and not adding vinegar, that is good for your gut health and kind of contributes to the overall bacterial community of your gut, meaning your intestines. You could probably find a lot more convincing information online, but I like to moderate that claim a little bit. All right, I'm going to put these out of the way because we're going to make them now, and I'll show you kind of a step-by-step for how we're going to get going. So this is all of this stuff that's going to go into that edgy veggie recipe. So this is a head of cauliflower that I just cut into chunks. If you wanted to be super delicate, you could cut them into little individual florets, but it works fine for me if it's just a big chunk. I also have carrots. I have about 6 carrots that I cut into coins. I'd say they're about a 1/4 inch thick. And I just did that by chopping. Again, it doesn't have to be precise. And I don't peel them either. I don't peel my carrots. I wash them to get like dirt off of them, but you don't need to peel them. And I just chop them up. Don't want that stem until they're about, little medallions, basically. I'm leaving it a little thick here because I don't want it to get mushy, and I want everything to be about the same size, so the density of this carrot is about the density of this cauliflower. It doesn't have to be exact, but they're about the same. The other thing that's going in here, right? So I've got carrot, I've got cauliflower, is an onion. So this is a cioppino onion, but I think it would also be really good with like a sweet onion, like a Vidalia onion, or just a yellow onion. If that's all you have in your house, that would be tasty too. And I just chopped it into little bits. So I'm not mincing it, but I'm leaving it in kind of big pieces that will ferment together. So again, I want them all roughly about the same size. And the other important ingredient, the one is kind of keeping me on the edge of coughing right now, are these jalapenos. So I cut 2 jalapenos into these strips. And I cut these a little bit thinner because in my first batch, I left them really thick and they're almost too thick to just eat on their own. So I cut them thinner so that I could eat them because it was like too much jalapeno, but everything gets a little spicy, which is why it's nice that they're in there. So we've got the cauliflower, carrot, the onion, and the jalapeno. And the other very important ingredient, I think, is garlic. I was talking with a friend this weekend who told me that he's allergic to garlic. I know that that happens, but it made me so sad because I love garlic so much. And I can't imagine if I was allergic to it. So if you're also someone who's allergic to garlic, you know, in any of my recipes, it's okay to omit garlic from the recipe. I talk a lot about it. So apologies if anyone else out there is allergic to garlic. I like to use about 7 or 8 heads of garlic in something like this. But again, it's up to you, whatever you like. If you want just a little bit, you know, be my guest. So I'm just removing the outer layer skin on that garlic. And I have some big cloves here. And I like to smash them a little bit with my knife rather than cutting them in half, because I think it kind of expresses some of the oils in the garlic, mashes it a little bit rather than just cutting it into halves. So I've got some kind of mashed up garlic that I'm going to add to it. And that is basically all of the vegetable ingredient that is going to go in here. The next fun thing that we get to do, and I was saying this at the top of the talk, is we get to add a bunch of spices. So, 7 or 8 heads or cloves? Cloves. Yeah. So yeah, right. This is a head. This is a clove. Sometimes I get confused with that. So yeah, 7 or 8 cloves of garlic. But again, up to you. Maybe 7 heads of garlic is what you like. So we are going to add some spices to this. So in terms of brining generally, I'm just going to give you an overview of some things that work well in almost any brined vegetable. And these are also culturally specific. So I'll just say that too, that, you know, I'm talking about the kinds of spices and flavors that I like, you know, because of my own cultural upbringing. But for you, there might be some that I don't mention. You're like, what? Are you kidding me? You didn't include that, you know, as a flavor for brine. So keep in mind, this is all coming from my like kind of Italian, Irish, German, Scottish, mixed up European American background. So here's some of the spices that I like to have in my brine veggies. Fennel seed is lovely. And we're keeping them as big, what am I saying? Spices, right? Not ground spices, because by leaving them larger and not ground into a powder, we're allowing that flavor to distribute a little bit more in the brine, but not have it be overwhelming. So we'll use whole spices like fennel seed, like black pepper. Mustard works really well here too. So these are yellow mustard seeds, but they also make black mustard seeds. This is coriander. So coriander seeds, they're lovely. These are some dried chilies, and there's so many different kinds of chilies, and they all have so many different kinds of flavors. So I would say whatever, you know, is one that maybe you're already familiar with, start with that one and then explore some different flavors. And dried chilies and fresh chilies have different names and different flavors. So try using dried ones and try using fresh ones, like a jalapeno versus a dried bird's eye chili. Bay leaf works really well. And we're so lucky to live in Northern California because we can go snatch bay leaves from our neighbors' trees and we don't have to pay for them. So bay works well in lots of things. Then I also have some dried chili flakes. So these would be whole dried chili peppers that get ground down a little bit. And this is very, very strong. So you would want to use just a little bit of that. There's dill seed. I love using dill in some of my other ferments. So you can use the seed in these. Oregano, I'm going to use oregano in this recipe. So dried oregano seeds. Caraway seeds, love caraway in my kraut. Or if you don't want to buy all these, they make something called pickling spice. And it just has a lot of these flavors already in it, right? It has it has bay, coriander, mustard. Looks like there's some juniper berries, chili, clove. It's like the whole deal is just here in a bag of pickling spices. So if you're somebody who has an extensive spice collection, you might just pick and choose with whatever you have already. Or if you're just starting out, you can go buy something called pickling spice in the grocery store, and that'll work just fine. It's the same thing, just already prepackaged for you. All right. So I'm going to now finish off this edgy veggies recipe. And this one, you know, even though I just went on this big spiel about spices, it actually only calls for oregano. That's the only spice that features in this mix. And it calls for about 1 to 2 tablespoons of oregano. So I'm going to start with 1. And I always like to kind of crunch my dried spices just to mash them up a little bit and release whatever oils are left in there. I think I'm gonna do like 1.5. 2 seems like a lot based on what I have. So that's about 1.5 tablespoons of dried oregano that I'm adding to the mix. And I want to just mix it up a little bit with my hands to make sure it's somewhat distributed. It's okay if it's not because it's all going in a jar anyway. Then I want to pack it into a jar. So I've talked a lot about fermentation vessels in this series, and you don't have to use a fancy glass jar. You can use plastic, you can use ceramic, you can use glass jars that you've recycled from other food as long as it's cleaned. You can use basically anything that's not metal because that can be reactive sometimes with the salty acidity that we're creating in the brine. So metal's not great. Or sometimes ceramics, they use a lead glaze. So you want to make sure you're not using that. I'm going to just kind of get it. I'm not going to push it down too hard, but I'm pushing down a little bit because I'm going to try to get as much as I can in here. Making sure I'm getting a little bit of everything, a little bit of the cauliflower, a little bit of the onion, a little bit of the carrot, the peppers. See how much I can get in there without it totally overflowing. I can get a little bit more. I'm basically just filling this up with the dry ingredient because then when I pour the brine over the top, it's going to fill in all of those spaces with liquid. So the liquid will find a way through. Okay, I think that's good. I ended up with a little leftover cauliflower, but I can eat that later. Or you can start another jar, it's up to you. But I'll push it down a little bit so that it stays, not overflowing, but that's it. This jar basically has all the spices and the vegetable material for that edgy veggie recipe from the Kirsten Shockey book. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and make a brine for this one right now. And I'm gonna follow her recipe, which is 1 gallon of water and a 1/2 cup of salt. So I just bought this because it was easier. It's already measured out. I'll pour a little bit into the glass so that there's room for me to put the salt in, because if not, it would be a little too full. And I know I'll have a little less than 1 gallon, but that's okay. It doesn't have to be perfect. And I have a little bit, where did it go? Right, I had a funnel, but salt, that's important. I've also talked about in this workshop using different kinds of salt. The one thing they advise against is using iodized salt. So I like to use sea salt. And this one in particular is a brand I like. You can use any brand. This is just the one that they have in the store that I shop at. It's this Redmond Real Salt. It's a fine sea salt. And I found that because it's finer, it tends to distribute better in my ferments, and it's a natural sea salt. So it's great. It's got all the minerals that I want in it. But you could use anything that you have on hand, as long as it's not like an iodized table salt, Okay, so there we go. I've got 1 cup or 1/2 cup, 1/2 cup of salt. So I'm just going to kind of pour it in here. See how well I can do this without my funnel. That's pretty good. Pour it into this bottle. And then I can just put the lid on and shake it up. So I'm just distributing the salt through the water so that the brine becomes the salt water that I'll use. And it ends up being a little pink because of just the color of this salt. It's a sea salt that has some pink in it. But if you were using just a very white sea salt, then yours probably wouldn't be pinkish like mine is. I'm gonna clean up all this salt I spilled. Don't mind me. Okay, so now I have this mixture that is a gallon of water and half a cup of salt. So I'm gonna go ahead and pour it into the jar. I'm gonna go a little fast at first and then just kind of wait and let it all fill up. Whoop, a little bit more. That's it. Okay, it's right to the top now. So you can see that I filled the whole thing up with water and there's just a little bit of veggies floating on the top, which is fine. Whoa, that jalapeno. Right in my throat. Okay, I'm gonna get a lid for this. I could use, you got me. You could use a towel, which is what I use in a lot of my other ferments. I just put a towel on top. You don't want to use a really tight lid in any of the ferments that I do on this, this show, because you're going to create an environment where lots of bubbles, lots of CO2 is going to come out. So if you had a tight lid on there, you could create a bomb, basically. You don't want to do that. So you could put a lid on top, just don't screw it tightly, leave it loosely fitted, or you could put a towel over the top. The one thing that I've noticed with brines especially is it can get very active. So I like to make sure that my brined vegetables are in some kind of a vessel. This is my green bean. So that if it spills over the top, it doesn't end up all over your countertop. So I recommend putting your fermenting vessels in some kind of a bowl or a plate, whatever you want, or put a rag underneath it that'll just soak up the liquid. It's totally your call, you know, wherever you want to do it. But for me, I find like a shallow bowl actually works perfectly because it collects any of the stuff that goes over it. So as with all my ferments, I need to date it so that I remember when it started. So I'll write April 14th, and I always write, you know, that you should name it. So I'll call this one, since it's her recipe, I'll call this the edgy veg. I called it edgy kraut, but it's edgy veg. So April 14th, edgy veg. And then this way I will remember when it's been a couple days and I'm like, wait a minute, when did I start that one? I'll remember when it started, and I'm going to keep an eye on it every couple of days. I'm going to just look, make sure things stay under the brine. You can just use your fingers to push things under. It's okay if things come up to the top. If it's very active and the brine spills over, you can always save the leftover brine, because you can just top it off, and you can keep this brine in your fridge for up to a week. So you can top it up with the extra brine just to make sure if it's under the brine, it's fine, right? And then basically after 4 or 5 days, it's a little warmer. So it might be 4 to 5 days rather than 6 to 7 days. You'll notice the bubbles, you'll notice the activity, you'll notice the smell, it'll be changing, and it'll also get cloudy. So I'll just show you the difference between the one that I just made and the one that I made a couple days ago, right? You see how much cloudier this liquid is. And that's great. That's a good sign. It's a sign that everything's working as it should. So those are some signs to look out for: is the smell, the bubbles, the bubbling over, and the cloudiness. And once you start to get those things all together, then you can start tasting. And like I said, with my green beans, I tasted both of these at 5 days. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is perfect. I want to eat this just like this forever. So I put it into the fridge. But the green beans, I was like, they just taste like salty green beans. They, they're not ready yet. So I left them another 4 days now, and they taste delicious. So even if you're following a recipe and it tells you to do a certain amount of time, that's no guarantee that it'll be correct. You really got to trust your own senses and your own intuition to know when things are ready. All right, cool. So that's the edgy veggie recipe. And I will definitely eat these later. All right, I'm going to make another, I'm going to demo another couple ferments for you, so you can see some differences and also see me use some different spices. So this one, I have a couple things to try here. I have these asparagus, which are in season right now. And I don't know about you, but I guess it was my mom. It was my mom or my grandma would always try to find the skinniest asparagus she could, you know, and I don't know, she thought that was the better asparagus, and it is very good. But the big old thick asparagus, I find that it's great for pickling, because sometimes the thinner ones, they just, they can get soft a little too fast, or the difference between 5 days and 6 days is a lot in terms of flavor or texture. So I actually prefer working with these really thicker asparagus when I'm fermenting. So these ones, I'm just actually going to cut the stems so that they're tall enough to fit right in the jar. And that's the other thing about fermenting whole veggies this way, is they're beautiful. You know, it gives you a really lovely visual element that you don't necessarily get from other kinds of ferments. So I'm just going to take these as they are and pop them into the jar, just like that. So now my jar has these beautiful asparagus in them. One of the heads fell off, put that in there. And now I can think about some different spices. So again, I could just use a tablespoon of this pickling brine, because it's got everything I want in there. It's all ready to go. But I think just for the sake of fun, maybe I'll throw some different things in here so you can see how it goes. So I'll put in, let's see, 2 bay leaves. These smell great. I'll put in some of the coriander seeds. So this is maybe, oh, what is that? Like a half a tablespoon, maybe 2 teaspoons of coriander seed. And I'll do some mustard, about the same amount, about 2 tablespoons or teaspoons of mustard. I'm going to put some black peppercorns in there. Ooh, this is open, or it's not open yet. Interesting. Black pepper or red pepper, pink pepper, mixed pepper. I mean, it's up to you. Whatever kind of pepper you have in your house works just fine. I'll put some of these chilies in. So these dried chilies are delicious, and they're not quite as spicy as using like a fresh chili, because it has, it's a more concentrated flavor, but I find that it's not quite as spicy. I think I'll also put some fennel. Why not? See how that goes. Maybe less fennel, just because it's kind of a strong flavor. And lastly, I have this dill seed. So I'll put a little bit of the dill seed in there. And these are just the seeds that are on the top of flowering dill. They're lovely. They smell really nice. All right, so now I have just a bunch of these spices down at the bottom of my jar. I have the asparagus in here, and maybe I will just kind of crunch a couple, just 2 cloves of garlic. And actually, if you're not going to eat the garlic itself, you can just leave the paper on it, because it's just for flavoring. Or if you want to go in and eat the garlic, which you absolutely can, then you can take the paper off. But it's your call. All right. So now that I've got all my spices in there, I've got the asparagus in there, I'm going to actually going to add a little bit more salt to this, because in the book it says that for things like cucumbers or for asparagus, because they're very porous vegetables, we're going to use a little bit more of salt, a little more salinity, in order to keep them crunchy. So if I was really good, I would start over with a whole gallon of water, and I would add that 3/4 cup of salt to that one. But I'm gonna cheat a little bit here and just eyeball it and add a little more salt to this one, so that I can just increase the salinity a little bit. And then I'll remix it. Perfect. Ooh, it's busy. And I will just fill up this container with my brine. There it goes. And so the little asparagus are starting to like poke out on the top here, and that's fine. One thing you can do if you want to keep them submerged, you have a couple options. The first is that you can use a piece of plastic. So these are actually just like plastic tops that I use on my Tupperware, because I've lost all my Tupperware lids. So you could use something like this, or you could use a plastic baggie, or you could use a piece of plastic wrap that you use for, you know, wrapping up leftovers. And you can basically just put this in here, you know, push it down so that it's touching the top of the veggies and not the veggies touching the air. And you can put something like a beet or something that's heavy inside the plastic. So it's not touching the liquid, right? This thing, the beet that I just put in here, it's not touching the liquid. So it's not, you know, imparting any of the microbes that are on the beet into that liquid. But it is helping to keep all of this stuff submerged under the liquid without touching it itself, right? So now my asparagus is all under brine, spices are all under the brine, and I have this kind of barrier, plastic barrier that I've created with a baggie and something heavy to help weight it down. There's lots of, you could buy a fancy weight. They have fermentation weights. You could use a clean rock. Make sure it's clean though, because I did once, I have so many stories of experiments gone wrong. I made this big batch of cucumbers and I had grown them myself. I was so proud. I was like, oh, I grew these cucumbers. I'm going to turn them into pickles. And they were floating at the top. So I put a rock on them, and it was just like a rock I found from the garden. And I just like rinsed it off real quick and put it in there, and they got really gross. So make sure you clean that rock really good, scrub it really well. Maybe run it through the dishwasher. I don't know. Or use a plastic barrier. That's a much easier solution. So there we go. Those are my asparagus. Those will be delicious. And I'll put them over here, and they have a little bit of a weight on them. Good question. Have you found that in-season vegetables ferment better? Are there really more microbes on something really fresh? Yeah, you know, I have noticed that. I have noticed that things that are in season, or for me, you know, I'm really lucky, and we're all lucky actually to live in this region where we can have access to fresh fruits and vegetables all the time, basically. And I will often get veggies from the UC Davis Student Farm, which is an all organic farm. And anything I make from them, it just ferments so well. It's great. It's like an automatic situation. But that being said, I ferment a lot with older veggies too. You know, like I like to use fermentation in my own life as a way to use things before they go bad. I really don't like having to throw away fresh vegetables. So if my family isn't getting around to eating it for some reason, it can always be fermented in my mind. So if it's like a really old head of cabbage or a really old cucumber or a really old cauliflower, if you're going to have trouble getting the fermentation going, you can always add liquid from a previous ferment, because that liquid is rich with microbes that have already gone through those waves of succession. And it's the lactic acid bacteria that you want. So you can actually pour a tablespoon of that into your liquid or your brine, or if you're making a shredded kraut, pour some of that liquid in there, and it will kind of jumpstart the microbial activity. So if you don't have access to like fresh organic veggies, that doesn't matter. You can ferment. And you can do that by kind of keeping a fermentation practice going so that you can use some of the older liquid to jumpstart your new ferment. If you don't have older liquid, you could also go, you could buy a fermented, you know, product in the grocery store too, a live fermented product. Or, which is kind of what I love about fermentation, you could reach out to your fermentation community, you know, and you can ask, hey, does anybody have some leftover brine? Or, you know, this isn't really starting, and, you know, can I talk to you about how you get it going? So it's a fun thing to do in community, you know, for that reason, I think. Okay, that was a great question. I can't believe I only have 10 minutes left. I want to show you just one more thing, which is actual cucumber pickles, right? So I'm going to grab a jar real quick. I need an extra jar. I didn't have one. All right. So I have another big jar that I'll use for these. And these are pretty big. Sometimes you can get smaller cucumbers in the summertime when it's their growing season, really. And those work well for this. I have not had success cutting cucumbers. So if you happen to have a big cucumber and you're like, oh, I'll just cut it into pieces, For me, I've never had it turn out well. It's better to keep them whole because the skin helps to keep the vegetable crisp and not get mushy. One way to check for good cucumbers is this is the blossom end of the cucumber. So when it's growing, this is the end with the flower. And it's usually the smaller end, and it usually is like a little lighter, and you can kind of see where a flower was growing from it. This end, just check to make sure it's firm. Just kind of squeeze it. Sometimes when you're in the grocery store, you'll squeeze the other end of the cucumber and you're like, oh, this one's great. But then you get to the end and it's super mushy. Like that's a sign that that one's not going to ferment well. So make sure you have firm cucumbers, especially at the blossom end, for fermenting. So I'm just going to kind of stuff these in here as I can. We'll see if I can get them all in. It's looking good. Oh no, that one's way too big. So you got to move them around a little bit. See if you can get them to arrange well. I totally understand why, you know, I don't know, different cultures have use like pits or cucumber Tetris, nice. Or bigger fermentation vessels, because it can get a little complicated trying to get these all in here. That's gonna have to be it. Sorry, you're the odd one out. Okay, great. So now I've got my cucumbers in here, and it's the same thing that I did more or less with the asparagus. I'm gonna add flavors that I like. In this case, lots of garlic, any spices. I think actually for this one, I'm just gonna use the pickling brine, or the pickling spices, sorry. So again, it's a mix of lots of different good stuff in here. And I'm just gonna go ahead and add in 2 tablespoons of my pickling brine. It smells so good. That cloves, it's like, whoa, oh, there's orange in there. I smell like orange rind. That's really good. Okay, so I've got my garlic, got my pickling brine in there, or my pickling spice. And then I'm gonna add the rest of my brine. Fingers crossed that it's enough. Oh, it's perfect. Okay, so that looks pretty darn good. That's got my pickles. It's got the yummy flavors that I put in there. The other thing I'm going to use, and you'll be able to read about this in the recipe that I'll make for your kid, is some leaves like grape leaves or oak leaves or raspberry leaves have natural tannins in them. And these tannins, it's said, when added to ferments, like things like cucumbers, can help to keep them crisp. So there's something that happens with the reaction between the enzymes that are in the cucumber and the tannins that are in these leaves that help to keep it nice and firm. So I have a vine growing in my backyard that is a grapevine, and I plucked this morning and I rinsed it off in cold water. And so I'm just going to go ahead and throw in 2, see how that goes? Throw in 2 leaves here on the top. And then this also serves as kind of like that natural barrier, you know, like the plastic did. Same thing. It'll serve as kind of a barrier, but to keep although these cucumbers are packed in there pretty good, I don't think they're going to float up to the top, but it helps to keep everything under the brine by putting these 2 leaves on top. So I'm experimenting a little bit by using these grape leaves so that the tannins can react with the enzymes in the cucumber and help to keep it hopefully nice and firm and not squishy cucumbers, which I've had a lot of. So fingers crossed, this one does not come out squishy. So that's basically it. I've got about 6 minutes left, and I want to leave room for any comments or questions that you have. But just to recap, we did a couple different fermented whole veggies using the brine solution, using different spice mixtures, and using some different techniques for closing your jars as well. And again, with these, I'm going to just wait about 4 to 5 days. I'm going to look for the activity of the microbes. I'm going to look for a cloudiness in the liquid, and then I'm going to taste. It's a little harder to taste with like a big old cucumber. So this one just kind of maybe wait for that 5 or 6 day mark and make sure all the other signs are there, the smell, the bubbling, the cloudiness, and then you can give one a try, cut off a little piece of it. And if it's not quite ready, you can just put it back in the brine. It'll be okay. And then once you're done with it, you can put it into your refrigerator and it will stay at that flavor for quite a while. And, or you can transfer it into a smaller jar if you want at that time, because basically you're trying to stop the fermentation process. Not completely, because you can't stop it completely, but you're going to slow it way down by changing the temperature to make it cold. Yes, there will be a recording of this. So please send me an email at communityferment@gmail.com. And in that, you can give me your address, your physical address, if you live in near this region, and I will bring you a kit. I think, I'm still thinking about it, but I think everyone's going to get the edgy veggie mix. So if that's something you wanted to make, I'll give you everything that you need to make this one. And that means the salt and the veggies and the jar and everything that you need. Would you also give us the dilly bean recipe with our kids? That sounds delicious. Yes, definitely. I will photocopy that for you too. The UC Davis Student Farm CSA is a great place to get a ton of organic produce, but the wait list is long. Yeah, I agree. I really, really love the UC Davis Student Farm CSA, and it's a great place to get organic veggies. Thanks, everyone, so much. Again, please reach out to me at communityferment@gmail.com if you have questions. I'll send you all a recording of this video, and make sure to give me your address so I can give you a free kit. Thanks so much for being a part of this community, and I hope to be with you all in person one day when we can all be in the library together. And hi, friends from the Radical Fermentation group at UC Davis. Hi. We'll see you all next time. Bye.